Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give it 1 second for a few more to tune in. We see a bunch of people flooding in, so in about 30 seconds, I'm going to start speaking. Welcome, come in, get settled. Okay. All right. So hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on project risk management. My name is Marissa Miller, and I'm on the learning team here at Eco Canada. A quick introduction to GoToWebinar. If you haven't been on any of our webinars before, you may notice that you're muted. With a high turnout today, everyone is automatically muted for the duration of the webinar, but this doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. There is a tab that says questions, chat. If you have any tech questions, we'll be active in there, myself or my colleague Danielle. So pop in there and ask us at any time. If you have a question for our speaker today, toss it in there and we'll have a Q&A session at the end where you can put these questions directly to Leroy. So I am joining today's session from Calgary, where ECO's head office is based. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement from Calgary. Eco Canada's commitment to reconciliation starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to live, work, and play within Treaty 7 territory. Eco Canada acknowledges the traditional territories and oral practices of the Niitsitapi, which includes Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai nations. We also acknowledge Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda, which includes Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. In addition, the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Thanks so much for tuning in. So today's distinguished, about as quickly, Eco Canada is the steward for the environmental workforce across Canada. So one of the things we do is we champion the end-to-end of an environmental professional's career. So we not only train environmental professionals, but we also address all of the labor market, a bunch of different research, and our efforts to promote and drive responsible, sustainable economic growth to ensure that environmental care and best practice is a priority. Now we'll talk about Leroy, today's distinguished guest, now that I've brought him up in there. He's from Meridus Management, Inc. Meridus and Eco Canada have announced a partnership. So Meridus brings decades of experience to project management training delivery for organizations and is joining forces with us here at Eco Canada. So together we can provide training for workers in the environmental, natural resource, and clean technology sectors. So Leroy speaking today is the co-founder of Meridus. So he has over 25 years of project management experience, with much of it focused on technical analysis, framework design, modeling, database management, absolutely everything. So in the past decade, Leroy has trained thousands of Canadian environmental and engineering consultants, which is why he's here today to speak to us about project management, specifically about risk management. So if everyone can bear with me 1 moment, I'm just going to turn the presentation over to him right now. And Leroy, once you get this, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you, Marissa. When you talked about the distinguished guest, I was wondering who else you had coming. I didn't realize that was me.
Right, so yes.
Thank you for that introduction. But yeah, today we're going to talk about project management risk. You gave a great introduction to me, so I'm not going to go over anything more. Maybe just to point out that, you know, my background is actually hydrogeology. I was a contaminant hydrogeologist for many, many years. But for the past 12 years, been providing corporate advisory services to the industry, including project management and project management training. And as Marissa talked about, a few years ago, we, myself and Farmars Bogzaran, incorporated a company called Meridus. And the goal of Meridus is really to bring project management training to our industry, really the environmental and engineering sectors. So we've developed a number of courses, you know, our flagship course being our Project Management Essentials course. And it was just a natural partnership with Eco Canada. So it's fantastic that we've been able to deliver our courses to them and also do webinars such as these with Eco Canada. So today, what are we going to talk about? The first thing I just wanted to touch base on is how we perceive risk and really in our day-to-day lives. And then I just want to talk about a few key definitions that includes project risk and project issues. And then I'm going to spend probably the bulk of our time together here talking about project management risk and a step-by-step process that we can use to manage risk in our projects. And then near the end, I want to talk a little bit about modeling schedule risk. When it comes to managing project risk, there's all sorts of neat technical things you can do with budgets, with schedules, really kind of high-end stuff for large projects. And I thought it'd be kind of neat just to give a little bit of insight on some of that. So I want to talk about actually numerical modeling schedule risk. And then at the end, I want to talk about day-to-day project risk management to wrap things up and really kind of tie it all together in an important message. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about, you may realize or may say, well, I don't do that into my day-to-day project management or risk management. And we'll talk about that at the end and how you can incorporate these ideas into your day-to-day risk management for your projects. So talking about risk, I thought we'd start off with a definition of risk. And risk can be a noun. So it is the possibility of a loss or injury, or is something that creates or suggests a hazard. I thought it was interesting that Merriam-Webster actually included someone in the definition as well. So actually identifying a person as a risk. And obviously risk can be a verb as well. And it's the act of risking something, to incur risk or danger of. But from all these definitions, I think what I'd like to focus on is this possibility. A risk has a chance of happening. Now, in our day-to-day lives, we manage risk automatically. We don't even think about it sometimes. For example, if I have a very important meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning, I may set the alarm on my phone, and I may set my alarm on my nightside clock. I'll have backup for that, and I'm kind of managing the risk of sleeping in and not making that meeting. So we do all these things through our lives almost automatically. And the risk can have small consequences, but sometimes the risks can have big consequences. And throughout our day-to-day activities, we can actually have big risks as in terms of risks of dying. So I wanted to think about that for a second, and taking kind of a silly example. But if let's say you live in Australia and you go swimming in the ocean, well, you have a risk of dying from a shark attack, and that is a risk. But if you live in Australia, the thing that you probably didn't think about is you also have a risk of dying from a kangaroo attack, which sounds a bit strange. But to bring something a little bit more to our daily experience, you also have a risk of dying by commuting by car. And these are risks that, especially someone in Australia manages day in and day out. Now, your risk of dying from a shark attack and your risk of dying from a kangaroo attack annually is actually the same as your risk of commuting by a car daily. And you can look this up online. It's quite interesting. That's about 1 in 10 million chance of death. So I don't know if people are surprised by that or say, well, that sounds about right. But one of the things you'll see in risk management is how we mitigate these risks. And one of the ways to mitigate risks is to eliminate them. So for example, let's say we didn't like this 1 in 10 million chance of death and we wanted to eliminate these risks. Well, commuting by car, if I'm working from home, I can eliminate that risk because I'm not doing that commute to work. Now, the kangaroo attack is obvious. I'm going to move out of Australia, and well, my chance of dying from a kangaroo attack might not be 0. It's pretty close to 0 if I don't live in Australia. And a shark attack, well, I'm just going to decide I'm not going to swim in the ocean. I'm going to swim in a swimming pool. And now I've eliminated those 1 in 10 million chances of dying kind of in my daily life. But sometimes things are not how they seem, because now if I'm swimming in a pool, I think I'm safe, but the chance of actually drowning is 1 in 100,000, which is quite amazing. And that's each and every time you go swimming. Swimming's actually a risky activity. So how we perceive risk sometimes is really important. And like I said, in our daily lives, we kind of do it automatically without thinking. But when it comes to project management, we need to take a more proactive and a more focused approach. So let's start with defining project risk. Project risk is any potential event or circumstance that would have an impact on the 4 key project constraints. Now, everyone, those 4 P project constraints are scope, schedule, budget, and quality. And when it comes to safety, safety is part of quality. A lot of times we're thinking quality in terms of quality of our deliverables, quality in terms of having validated deliverables, meeting our technical specifications for a project. And that is true, but quality also includes personal safety. And because of that, don't think of quality as the last project constraint, think it as the ultimate project constraint. Now, that's project risk, but what is a project issue? Well, project risk, again, is a potential event. It has that probability or chance of happening, and it requires a proactive approach to manage. Whereas we define a project issue as an event that has already occurred. So something has happened and it requires a reactive approach to manage. And when it comes to risk management, there's actually kind of a link between these two, and that's our contingency plan. And we develop contingency plans that are steps to be taken if a risk occurs. So we'll look at our potential risks, decide which ones have a high probability of happening or have a high impact on our project. And for those risks, we'll develop contingency plans. So if those risks become project issues, we have a guide and we can react quickly to deal with them. Now, defining project risk management. So risk management is the practice of identifying, assessing, mitigating, and accepting risk. Now, looking at this definition, people's ears may peak up and say, accepting risk? Why would I accept risk? Accepting risk is a really important part of risk management, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So, as I mentioned, we're going to go through the process step by step, and I've defined 5 steps in project risk management here. The first step is identifying risks. The second step is to mitigate those risks, the ones you've identified. The third step is any risks that haven't been mitigated, you need to accept. And again, we'll talk about that in some more detail. Step 4 is to monitor these risks as the project is being executed. And the 5th step is to respond when a risk actually materializes and becomes an issue. So these are the 5 steps in risk management. We'll go through each one by one. So first of all, to identify risks. And that is putting a list together of all the potential risks. And generally for larger projects, you're going to have a brainstorm with the entire team and try to decide what are all the potential risks for this project. And again, a risk is anything that could potentially impact our project's key constraints and therefore our project's success. And we generally place these risks into a document known as a risk register. And a risk register is a list of all our risks, but it's more than that. A risk register also includes analysis and answers important questions about each risk. So some of those questions could be, what is the likelihood that this risk will happen? What is the impact and severity? What is our contingency plan for that risk? What is the priority level and who owns the risk? These are all questions that should be answered in a risk register. And I thought I'd give you an example of a risk register for a major project. And this is a project I've been involved in for over 10 years now, and it's the Esquimalt Harbor Remediation Project. Esquimalt Harbor is just west of Victoria Harbor and Victoria itself. And Esquimalt Harbor is home to CFB Esquimalt, the Royal Canadian Navy's main base on the West Coast. It's also home to the Public Works graving dock for repairing major ships. And it's home to the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations as well, and other industrial activities. So it's a very, very busy and active harbor. And the remediation project, its purpose was to remediate historically contaminated sediments, and it was funded by FCSAP, the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plans. And there were a lot of drivers for these projects. This harbor has been active for over 100 years. There were many contaminants of concern identified. Both human health and ecological risks were identified. One of the main goals was to help clean up the harbor so that the First Nation fisheries for the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations could be active again. So we had a project budget and a schedule, and for this portion of the remediation, which is really the hotspot remediation, we had $155 million and had to complete by 2020. So this is kind of a simple project schedule. A lot of work, of course, was done before 2016. We did options analysis, risk assessments, but as part of that, before actually getting into the design of the project, we developed a risk register because there was a lot of potential risk for this project. We were working right alongside an active military base. We had a very tight timeline. We had to finish in 2020 because that's when that round of fix-up funding ended. So very tight timelines. So for this project, we developed a very detailed risk register. We defined the category of risk. Again, whether that was one of our four key constraints, was it a scope risk, a schedule risk, a budget risk, or a quality risk? Each risk had a title, description. We talked about the maximum consequences in terms of dollars, the probability of it's happening. This was done in a very large brainstorming session with the project team. So we had a very detailed risk register. And from that risk register, we actually produced a heat map for presentation to some of the people actually funding the project and looking at the project. And we could talk about the likelihood on the bottom axis of a risk event happening, the left being rare, the right being almost certain. And then the impact of those risk events are on the x-axis, going from insignificant at the bottom to severe at top. And we could rate each risk in terms of level. You know, is it a low level risk, significant, or very high? And you can see the color scheme goes from green to deep red on that. What this allowed us to do, it allowed us to focus our mitigation efforts and our contingency planning on those possible and likely risks that would have major and severe impacts. And this gave us a fantastic tool to really focus whatever time we had in terms of risk management on risk that would impact the project. And as the project went on, so we initially had our first risk map in 2015, just before we started the actual remedial design of the project. And as the project continued, you could see that actually the heat map of the risks changed, and it looked better and better as we went on. We were retiring risks, we were mitigating risks, and actually we had some risks that actually became issues, but we had our contingency plans in place and we were able to deal with them. And I'm happy to report that for that stage of the Esquimalt Harbor remediation project, we finished the remediation in 2020. It was on budget. And one of the reasons we were able to do this was because we managed the risk so well. And that first step in identifying risks, it was done very, very well for this project. So great example how a risk register can really help a project be a success. So the second step after identification of risks is mitigation. Now, there's three ways I'm going to discuss that we can actually mitigate risks. The first way is to eliminate the root causes of risk. And let's go through a few examples of that. For example, when it comes to project scope, one of the risks might be that project requirements are not well understood. Now, this may seem as it's kind of vague, but really when we've done an assessment on project failures throughout our industry in the last 10 to 15 years, having the scope ill-defined is probably one of the biggest project risks and one of the things that caused a lot of losses for projects. So a way to eliminate that risk is have a clear contract outlining the project scope and deliverables. And I mean very, very clear contract. We were shocked to see many companies actually get engaged in projects without even having a contract in place, which is quite incredible. So that's just one way to eliminate that scope risk. Another way, or another risk we could look at is schedule. So the risk could be weather impacting our field work, and everyone who does field work understands this. Now, one way to eliminate that risk is we could employ field methods and equipment that could be utilized in all weather conditions. Now, this may have an extra cost to the project. However, that cost may be valid if we can eliminate that schedule risk. Another risk to look at, budget, and that could be changes in quotes from services from suppliers could be a risk. Not only services, but for materials. Anyone who's been involved in getting quotes over the last couple of years have seen just dramatic changes in costs. So one of the ways we could eliminate that risk from our project is get lump sum quotes from the suppliers that are good for the life of the project. Again, these lump sum quotes may actually be higher than the initial time and materials or quotes that you get from suppliers. But the suppliers are now assuming that risk. So by getting those lump sum quotes, we can eliminate that risk at the cost of spending a little bit more money. And quality, finally, we'll talk about a quality risk. And this is going to be a safety one. So we could have a project where we have overhead power lines that represent a safety hazard. Could be a remediation project, a drilling project. One of the ways to eliminate that risk is have the overhead power lines relocated. And this would be for a big project that would go on. You just contact the utility company. I've actually worked on projects where that's happened before. Now, not all risks can be eliminated. So if we can't eliminate the root cause of a risk, the next step is to minimize the probability occurrence or the impact of the risk. So for example, quality, let's look at that overhead power line situation. It's just not practical to relocate the overhead power lines for many, many of the projects that we work on. They're shorter duration. It's just not going to happen. So one of the ways to minimize those risks are have the overhead power lines marked. You'll see that often with the red or yellow flagging on power lines. And have a full-time spotter during field work when the activities are close to those power lines. So that's one way to minimize the probability that an incident will happen with the power lines. Another example, schedule. So we talked about weather impacting field work. A lot of people work on portfolio of sites for clients, large number of sites that need work done over a fiscal year. Well, one of the things we can do, if possible, is plan our field work in better times of the year. So when the weather's not good, we can do a lot of our planning, and then hopefully in the better times of the year, get out and do the field work. And then when the weather is poor again, do our reporting. So that's one of the ways we can manage that risk through mitigation. And finally, the last risk mitigation method I want to talk about is passing risk on to a third party. Now, you may think, wow, that's just passing the buck on to someone. And no, that's not the case at all. When you pass risk on to another party, you want to pass risk on to a party that's better able to manage that risk than you are. And that's the goal. And an example, let's say, we talked about the budget risk and changes in quotes from services from suppliers. Well, one of the ways to deal with that risk is pass that risk on to the client directly and have them engage the suppliers. That often happens with third-party billing. That way the client accepts that risk and you don't have to worry about that risk in your budget. So, the risk could have been, let's say, when it comes to safety or technical issues. And safety, you may pass that on to a firm that has just far more resources to manage those safety risks. Or when it comes to a technical risk in terms of design, you may pass that on to a third party that has an expertise in that design, right? So you want to pass on to risk to parties that are better able to assume that risk. So now we're going to talk about acceptance. And as we just reviewed, we try to mitigate those risks. So we can eliminate some, we can mitigate others, and we can pass them on. But what's important to remember is what left over doesn't disappear. Those risks will exist now for our project going forward. So we have to accept the consequences of those risks. We have to understand these risks may come up, and we're going to accept those if the project is going to continue. But conversely, we don't have to accept the consequences. We could say, you know what, the risk to this project, whether they're technical risks, risk to the company, or health and safety risks are too great for us, and you actually reject that project or work with the client to change the scope so the risks become acceptable. But it's important to realize is when you've done that assessment and mitigation, for the project to go forward, you need to accept the consequences of those risks. One of the ways that help us accept those consequences are the development of contingency plans. So we develop contingency plans for when those risks become issues, and then we have a plan in place that we know we can deal with that risk if it materializes. And also, too, I just wanted to give a quick note about insurance. Insurance can help us accept risks, especially risks that we don't identify specifically in a risk register. For example, every project has the chance that there be a technical error made that's usually not identified in a risk register. Or, an employee may drive their car into some sort of equipment on a client site and cause some damage. You don't generally have that identified in a risk register, but you have insurance to help you with those. So for those technical issues, you have errors and emission insurance. For an employee driving the car into some equipment and damaging it, you have general liability insurance. And there's other insurance. You have directors and officers insurance, pollution prevention insurance, and those help you manage and accept those risks for the project. Now, step 4, monitoring risk. So a good project manager monitors risk during his project execution. He's actually keeping track of scope, schedule, budget, and quality, but also understanding what risks are potential and making sure those risks don't pop up. And that involves good communication with the team. Ensure you have status updates to your team members and stakeholders about the potential risks, and checking in with your individual task managers. Some of them may be managing the risks on site, for example. So you need that communication from them about that. And also, too, when it comes to the risk register, you want to ensure that you're keeping an eye on that and updating it. For example, for the Esquimalt Harbor remediation project, for the first few months in the project, and as the project was forming, we actually revised the risk register every 3 months, and then we went to every 6 months after that once the project was going. But we kept our eye on the risk and made sure those updates were made. Now, another thing about monitoring that might not seem so obvious at first, but collaboration and communication is so important when it comes to risk management. What happens a lot, risks pop up and people don't feel empowered to mention those risks or bring that up or manage them. And it's so important to do that. So one of the best things you can do for risk management is build a culture of collaboration, openness, honesty, and good communication. I'll give you an example of that. About 20 years ago, I was working at Secor in Vancouver. And at that time, we had decided to adopt a real culture of philosophy. And the decision was made a few years ago, as a lot of our clients were expecting more rigorous health and safety procedures. And initially the management looked at it going, wow, what is that going to cost us? But we did a complete change in our thinking. And we thought, we're not worried about the cost. Safety is important to us. And actually, we're not going to let the clients or even the province dictate our safety measures like, oh, if we're just as good at that, it's going to be good. No, we decided to have a very robust health and safety program and made it the #1 criteria that we do any work for. Like health and safety was #1, but it wasn't just a slogan or speech. We really developed this culture of health and safety. For example, before we started this program, we would have about 5 to 6 near misses reported every year. Once we started this culture and had everyone working on it, that went up to 300 or 400 near misses reported every year. Now, that doesn't mean we were doing things much less safely, but people were empowered and they thought about what they're doing and they wanted to share their experiences. And this got to the point where one of our junior project managers was driving by a site one day, not our site, another consultant site, but saw someone at the bottom of an excavation. And it was a dangerous excavation. It was not shored up, it was narrow, and they were well over their head in the excavation. She stopped, went over to the site manager, demanded to speak to the site manager, told them to get that person out of the excavation right away, which they did, and she explained the reason for that. And it was just amazing to have someone so empowered that not only they would flag a hazard on their own work site, but when they saw something outside of their work, they did. So when it comes to monitoring and managing risk, I cannot overemphasize that collaboration and empowerment of the team. It really does make a difference. Finally, responding to a risk. If at any point a project risk becomes an issue, it's time to respond. And hopefully you have the risk register ready to go and your contingency plans. So you're going to have the tools to deal with that, with these issues that have come up, these realized risks. And remember that project risk management is the practice of having prepared for those risks and having a great plan in place so you're not caught off guard when those risks happens. Again, that's why the identification of those risks are so important at the beginning, because if you've missed some big risks, then you're not going to be prepared to deal with them when they become issues, or they might be even so much so that they could cause project failure because you haven't been able to respond to them correctly. So again, project risk management, step by step. First step is identify risks. Get those risks into a risk register. Second step, mitigate those risks. You've gone through the risk register, you've assessed those risks. Now you mitigate them where possible, either eliminating the risks, reducing the consequences of the risks, or passing those risks on to a third party. Step 3, we accept those risks. And again, we don't have to accept the risks. We can actually reject the project or talk to the management, talk to the client, change the scope if necessary. But it's important to realize if you're going to go forward in the project, you have to accept the identified risks that you haven't mitigated. Step 4 is to monitor those risks. And as I mentioned, having that culture of empowerment, having people, that are willing to speak up and look out for these incidents is just so powerful when it comes to risk management. And finally, responding to risks. So when risks become an issue, we hopefully deal with the minor ones quickly. For the major ones, hopefully we have a contingency plan in place and we can act quickly to respond to those. As I mentioned, I wanted to talk about modeling schedule risk. Again, those were the basic steps in project risk management, but there's a lot of tools, advanced tools and techniques out there. Again, you'll see just incredible budgeting tools for modeling budget risks. And I want to talk a little bit about what you can do for schedule risks. Now, when it comes to schedule risk analysis, and I'm going to be talking about computer modeling the risk, the reason we do that is we want to look at the probability of completing project milestones by certain dates. Now, and what we're hoping to do is produce more realistic target dates for milestones than the basic CPM dates. CPM dates are critical path method, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The other thing that modeling gives us is we're able to identify tasks that have the greatest sensitivity on schedule outcome. My background is a numerical modeler for the fate and transport of contaminants in the subsurface. And anyone who's done numerical modeling knows that the sensitivity analysis is one of the most important things you do in your model. You look at your boundary conditions, sensitivity to parameters and contaminants in your model. The great thing about scheduling model risk is you can look at the sensitivity of different tasks and you can figure out which tasks need to have more effort to put to them to keep on track, to keep your whole schedule on track. So, for example here, let's look at a small project, which is 6 tasks. 3 are in series and 3 are in parallel. Now, I mentioned the critical path and the critical path method. The critical path is simply the chain of tasks that sets where our milestone is going to be. It's often called the long pole in the tent. It is what is going to drive that milestone date. What are the tasks that link together that gives us essentially that critical path that defines when milestones are going to finish and when the project is going to finish. Now, sometimes the problem with the critical path is it changes. So for example, let's say one of these other 3 tasks all of a sudden go over schedule. That task becomes the critical path. And so when trying to determine a project schedule, understanding the critical path is important. Now, in a simple project like this, 6 tasks, it's pretty easy to keep track of. But if you move to a massive project with hundreds or thousands of tasks, and this is a schedule from a project that I've worked on and actually done schedule modeling on, and each one of those little bars has tasks rolled up on them. Many of them have 10 tasks in them. Trying to find and determine the critical path can be really hard. Now, in Microsoft Project, you can say, hey, show me the critical path, and it will highlight all the tasks in red and all the links and showing you that critical path to the end of the project. However, as the project continues and some of the tasks may go long, that critical path could change and change drastically. So that's why we use schedule modeling to get an idea on when those milestones could actually be completed. So what do we do with schedule modeling? Well, we do Monte Carlo analysis. We're going to apply some randomness to the task lengths in these schedules. Generally, when you have a schedule and a task, for each task, you have a duration of that task. Let's say it's 4 weeks or 20 working days. When we do Monte Carlo analysis, we don't assign that task a specific duration. We define it a probability for that duration. Most likely that task is going to finish in 20 days, but there's a possibility it might finish a little bit earlier and a possibility it might finish later. And for each and every task in our schedule, we don't give it a specific length for that task, or rarely we do, but instead we give it a probability that when that task is going to occur. And then what we do is we simply select randomly from that probability for each and every task a random date somewhere in that distribution, right? Randomly, it's probably going to be what you've selected, but it might be a little bit shorter, it might be a little bit longer, and rarely it might be really long or really short. And we just select those randomly. And we do this over and over and over again, thousands of times. And what we end up with are not milestone dates, but we end up with another curve of probabilities. This time, that output probabilities is the probability that those milestones or the project will finish on a certain date. This is kind of the inputs that we would use for a schedule model. As I mentioned, we have a task that could take 4 weeks or 20 working days, but optimistically, that task may end up to a week early, and we say pessimistically, the task may end up 2 weeks late, right? So we can put that into our model. Now, if we start with just a simple schedule, we have a bunch of tasks in a row, we have an idea when our milestone is going to be. But when we do the schedule modeling, now we're applying distribution curves to every task, and we just run a simulation. So randomly, that first task all of a sudden just became long. And so did the second task. The other task actually finished a little bit early. But at the end of that simulation, you can see our milestone had actually moved from the critical path method to the right. So we're trying to judge what is our risk of that milestone actually completing on the time that we said it would. We run the simulation again. Hey, this time that first task is actually just randomly happens to be a little bit shorter. And the other two tasks are very close to their probability on when we thought they would complete. But that ends up having that milestone now before that critical path date that we would use when we have hard-coded tasks. And we do this thousands and thousands of times. So let me give you an example of actually running a model. So let's say we have a start date of January 1st for this project. We have 10 tasks, 20 days each, all in series, and we have an end date of October 7th. And for each task, we're going to assign a probability. For this case, we're just going to assign an even probability. There's a chance, let me go back. There's going to be a chance that it could finish a week early, a chance that it'll finish a week late. Really, those outer bounds are low probability. It should finish around plus or minus 4 weeks. So what do we get out of that simulation? Well, for the milestone or for the finish date, we don't get a single number, we get a range of probabilities on when the project is going to finish. Now, if I go back, our end date was October 7th for that milestone. And if I go to this probability graph, October 7th is the 50% chance it's going to finish, which actually makes sense when you think about it, because we had a normal distribution around that finish date. So half of the time the project's going to finish earlier and half the time it's going to finish late. And actually, if we wanted to be confident that that we want to have a milestone date where we think we can meet, we might select the 90% confidence interval. So we might use October 16th for that milestone. Now, most of the projects you're working on, you're not going to be scheduling modeling. The important takeaway from this is projects generally tend to drift to the right because of this randomness through the schedules, right? It just, if you want to be confident in a date and you're looking at your critical path, in your project and you look at the milestones on that critical path and the finish dates, more than likely it will be later than that. And that's important to remember if you have tight deadlines for your project. One quick other thing that modeling schedule that can tell us, I think this is something that's really neat as well. As you can tell, I'm a project management nerd. I love this stuff. We're going to do the same kind of simulation on a schedule, but this time we're going to have our 5 tasks at the beginning grouped together, and there's a milestone. And then before we can do our next tasks, that milestone has to be completed. And each of these tasks are now going to be 100 days. So instead of having 10 tasks in series, we're going to have a group of 5 tasks in parallel and then a group of another 5 tasks in parallel. But at the end of the day, we have the same start and end dates for the project. And just like before, we're going to assign a distribution for those tasks. So for the upper project, we had a pessimistic date of 5 weeks. So that's 125% of what our most likely date was. For this bottom schedule, I'm going to tighten that up. I'm going to say, even though these tasks go for 100 days, I'm still going to give it only a week difference. So really our probability is really tightened on these tasks, right? So instead of being 125%, it's only 105%. And we're going to run the schedule model again. Now you would think, okay, well, the date should be on October 7th again, and it probably even should be a greater probability. Well, the interesting thing is when you run a model like this, you find out that the 50% probability is almost a week later. That's really bizarre. And actually, there's almost no chance of the project finishing on the October 7th, your original date. This is the other neat takeaway from the schedule modeling risk, and that is merge bias. So what happens is when you have a number of tasks that are merged into a single gated milestone, that means that milestone must be completed before next tasks can happen. What happens is any one of those tasks, 1 through 5, randomly could become the critical path and push that milestone to the right. And just based on statistics, that path generally does get pushed to the right. So we call that merge bias. And the takeaway for this in your projects is to be aware when you have a lot of tasks merging into a single milestone that must be completed before moving on to the project, is that there's a high probability that that milestone is going to move to the right because of the randomness in those tasks, and any one of those tasks could push the milestone to the right. Again, merge bias, a really neat takeaway from schedule modeling. So some final thoughts. And I wanted to talk about this day-to-day project risk management. As you saw, we talked about a lot of things, even when it came to the risk management process with these steps. You may not employ those in a lot of your projects, but we managed our project risk like we manage the risk in our day-to-day activities. It's almost automatic for us. Projects we do day in and day out generally have well-defined risks. Let's take a phase 2 environmental site assessment, for example. You know, we have to do utility clearances, traffic control, we schedule around weather, we schedule around the client's schedule. These are all potential risks for us in this project. We also have tailgate safety meetings to identify any last-minute risks on site. So this risk management activity we do is, I call it automatic. We kind of build it in, we think about it. Or we don't think about it. It's automatic. However, when we start a new type of work or larger projects, we really need to dedicate time to understand the risks of those new activities. You know, people do get into the groove with their regular projects, and sometimes they forget about the risks that might be apparent in newer projects and larger projects that they've never done before. And what's interesting is the time that we need to spend on risk management for those new projects is high, and it's really high. It's higher than most PMs account for. You know, we had a great opportunity to spend time for risk management on the Esquimalt Harbor remediation project, and we did spend a lot of time, and it really paid off. But to manage that risk effectively took a lot of time and a lot of effort. To put that risk register together and follow all the other steps in risk management. Now, you know, when it comes to our day-to-day activities, we might want to do new and interesting things. Like you may want to climb Mount Everest, for example. Well, that has a risk to it, you know, but hey, so does commuting by car. It has risk to it as well. And sometimes we're not good managing or understanding the risk of new activities. You know, if a person decides I'm going to go climb Mount Everest and signs up with a company and goes do it, they know, oh, it's a risk, but you know, how much riskier is it than commuting by car? Well, it's extremely risky. It's about 380,000 times riskier. I think it's like there's a percent chance, like greater than one, of dying each and every time you climb Mount Everest. So it's a very risky activity. So I think that the takeaway from everything that I've been talking about here is when we start new, interesting, and much larger projects, you need to ensure you budget the proper time to include the steps in project risk management. That's really important. Again, make sure you're identifying new risks and managing risks well in your day-to-day projects. Absolutely. Try not to be so automatic sometimes when it comes to risk management, but when you start a new and interesting project, make sure you take those steps in project risk management. Again, those steps are to identify the risks, build a risk register, and not only that, answer those important questions that a risk register must answer. Mitigate those risks. So, you know, I don't want to get killed by a kangaroo in Australia. So I am going to eliminate that risk by leaving Australia. Or I am going to reduce the consequence of that risk happening by just staying in the major urban centers. I'm not going to go out in the country. And if, oh my goodness, I purchased a package from a company that I have to go pick out that's in the country that happens to be next to a kangaroo preserve, I'm going to pass on that risk. I'm going to call Marissa and ask her to go get that package for me. So mitigate the risk, either eliminate them, minimize the consequences of them, or pass on the risk. And then the third step is accepting that risk. Whatever risk is left over doesn't disappear. We need to accept that risk, and help us to accept those risks are putting in those contingency plans for those risks that either have a high probability of happening or that could have a big impact on our project. Step 4, monitoring the risk. And as I mentioned, the most important thing you can do to monitor risk is build an environment in your company that is one of collaboration and one of empowerment for the people on the project. It really is kind of the hidden gem of project risk management. And finally, step 5, respond to the risks. So when those project risks become issues, you can respond to them. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. I just wanted to give a quick plug for the Project Management Essentials course that I had mentioned that we have on with Meridus. Again, the course is fantastic for teaching you these essential elements for project management. A lot of the things I talked about today, scope, schedule, budget, tasks, deliverables, when it comes to empowering and communication is covered in that course. Even things as basic as predecessor, successor tasks, it's all covered there and will help you understand this process much more. And again, how this process works throughout the life cycle of a project. So that's all I had for today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leroy. So looking at the questions here, we have a couple for you. There are going to be a couple things I'm putting in the chat right now for everybody. One of the questions that I've gotten asked is a link to the first webinar, so part 1 of this series. So everyone listening, I've just put that in the chat now. And another question is finding the course that you just mentioned. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now as well.
Okay, so thank you.
And those are both in the chat for everybody there. So a couple of questions here. So the first one, and I know that you touched more on scope in the first conversation, but scope when relating to risk. So the first question I have is saying that, you know, when proposals are written, that services are often under budgeted and scheduled aggressively. So what is your experience on scoping out and estimating a project realistically when it comes to adding these risks into scope?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is almost a course on itself, Consulting 101, right? Because when you're writing competitive proposals, you don't have a lot of time to do this. The one thing I can say to that is when you're writing a proposal for a project that you're well familiar with, you have an advantage because you understand those risks well, right? So know where you've done your work before and where you've managed risks on very similar projects. That will allow you to be more competitive because you've done a lot of those work in managing the risks. But on the flip side, if you are working on a project and a proposal that's new, that includes a lot of new tasks, and it could be interesting and much larger, and understanding that it is competitive, you have to put in that time to risk manage the project. You really do. One is assess the risks at the proposal stage in a go, no go, right, as an overview. And then when the project starts, I know it's tough, especially in a competitive project, but to be successful, you're going to have to include that time for risk management. And it's difficult. Now, the larger the projects are, the easier it is to kind of get that time in for risk management, especially at the beginning, but it is an important part. So I hope that gives kind of 2 points to the question, but it is a hard thing to do, especially on competitive proposals.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is asking, are there any risk management softwares you can recommend? And ones for maybe small nonprofit organizations? Are there ones that you know of that might be on the cheaper side for a nonprofit, or maybe if they have more resources, any that you would know of there as well?
There is not. Well, no, I shouldn't say there's not. There's not that I'm familiar with. Now, there is risk management software out there. One, the things that I would look at, first of all, is building up your own risk register for your work, right? That's something you could do in Excel. And you could go look at lots of examples on there. That's something you can do for free. You can do the same thing when it comes to budgeting. And for a nonprofit, you may not be budgeting a lot of expenses, but even people's time, right? And when it comes to scheduling, again, for example, the software I was using, and I didn't come up with the name, but it's called Full Monty. It's actually the Monte Carlo software. It's made by a company called Barbacana, and it's actually a plugin for Microsoft Project. The unfortunate part is a lot of the specific software for risk management is extremely expensive. I think that plugin is 4 times the cost of what Microsoft Project costs, for example, right? So that's kind of the issue. So my suggestion, especially for a small company, is go out there, get whatever free resources you can online, and then roll your own is the best way to do it.
Okay. So kind of building off of that, another question here. The tracking, modeling, and planning requires a lot of dedicated preparation and expertise. Can you recommend a project size threshold that corresponds with the number of people who are involved in it, or the level of detail and advanced planning that has to go into it? So recommending a proportion of project budget that corresponds with the planning and risk management.
Knew this was going to come up. It is a difficult question again. So I always say when you look at fees in terms of a project, and it changes with size. For smaller projects, the amount of fees that you spend on a project might be 5 or 10% of that project just to manage it, right? As projects become larger and larger and larger, you might be dedicating 1 or 2% of your time to project management. And then within that 1 or 2%, some of that is going to be dedicated to risk management. The amount that you're going to be dedicating to that is again going to depend on is the scope of work new and different compared to what you're used to doing, or can you use a lot of the methods that you already have in place? And secondly, when it comes to the size of the project as well, in terms of budget, you'll probably want to spend more money. So, if you're looking at $100,000 remediation versus the $150,000 project or $150 million project at Scrambled Harbor, we spent a lot of time on it. One is because budget was important, but also 2, spending that budget by a certain date was extremely important. So there's no hard and fast rule of thumb, and I think I've approached all the projects kind of as unique, right? But just remember that it's going to be higher and higher costs as you take on new work or larger projects, right? And that's just something you're gonna have to gauge from experience.
Okay. All right, I think we have time for maybe just one more question. So is there a procedure, when those risks stop being risks and turn into problems, turn into issues? Is there a procedure for that, or a way that you can, once it starts and you're not sure where it's scoping, but you sort of scope for it, is there sort of a next step?
Yep. If you look online, problem solving, right? And there's some great processes for problem solving. And actually, in our project management essentials, we talk about a 5-step process for problem solving. So when a risk actually becomes an issue, we go through the 5 steps that you need to attack that, right? And go through that. And we talk about that actually in the project management essentials. But there's good resources online for that as well. So what you want to be looking at are for problem solving techniques, right? So again, when those risks manifest themselves, hopefully you have a contingency plan in place, but a lot of times you don't, and that's totally common. But then you jump into the problem solving part of that.
Okay, awesome. All right, thank you so much, Leroy. I'm going to take back the screen for just one quick second. And
Sure.
for everybody that joined today, what's going to happen after this is you're going to be emailed a link to watch this later. So people have been asking if they get a copy of the presentation after. You do get a copy of this recording. So you won't have a copy of the slides, but you'll have a copy of the recording. Yeah, so I'm going to take back over as presenting. Okay, and just to answer the other questions and people that were asking about online courses, not only can you download this online course itself here with the essentials that we've been talking about, but you can also do it with a bundle, which gets you access not only to Leroy's course, but also our sort of step 2 on the course of applying it to the environmental sector. And you can also purchase it as part of an essential skills training package, which includes technical writing, communication, and navigating law as well. And then just other eco-learning offerings. We have these online courses like we've been talking about, webinars like you just attended, and we also do have virtual instructor-led training workshops as well. And that's just our quick plug for eco training. And then thank you very much. So I know there were still some questions here. If you have any questions about eco training, you can email us. If there's any specific questions that you'd like to run past Leroy, you can toss them to this email as well, and I will pass them on to Leroy. And on that note, it is time for us to end today. So thank you so much for attending, everybody. Like I said, you will receive a copy of this in your email. And I think that's it for today.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you, Danelle, who's in the background as well.
Right. Thanks very much, everyone.